processing in autism. And I'd like to start just with a quick observation that sensory processing is something we likely can all relate to. As we know, we're a neurodiverse population. And because of that, most people can relate in some way to an experience where they feel like maybe they are seeing the world differently than someone else. And when we say that, we usually are meaning that metaphorically. Today, though, we are going to ask how people on the autism spectrum may see the world differently as well, but we are going to actually ask that question in a much more literal way. And I am excited to show you how using the tools we have in the neuroscience laboratory can give us a window into how the brain is processing visual information, both in neurotypical development and in autism. And you will get to hear today, not just from me, but from some of my colleagues as well about several different types of sensory processing, including visual, touch, and auditory processing. And I'm also personally very excited that we're going to hear about some of the creative approaches and technologies that are being used to help us answer questions about sensory processing in ways that are new and really informative. But as a first step, when we are doing neuroscience research that looks at mechanisms of any type of sensory processing, I think it can be useful to take a step back and think about what do we know, what don't we know, and importantly, how might we use the new knowledge that we are gathering from our studies? We know that sensory differences are very common in autism. So individuals on the autism spectrum may be either more responsive or less responsive to certain sights, sounds, touch, tastes, or smells. They may seek out specific types of sensory inputs, and then they may avoid others. And we often hear from both individuals on the spectrum, as well as their parents and caregivers, that some of these sensory differences can be a source of distress. Examples may be when there's too much noise, or there are bright lights or textures that are bothersome. But of course, with most things in life, what we know is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's even more that we don't know. So we still don't understand a lot about what is different in the brain as it processes sensory information. And I'm putting that just under the surface here in this image because we are going to talk about some of the things that we have learned already and some of the next steps that we are taking in our session today. Developing that knowledge really matters because if we know specifically how sensory processing is different in individuals on the autism spectrum, then we can take the next step of connecting those brain changes to what is happening in real-world sensory processing. And that then opens a brand new door, which is the opportunity to be much smarter and more specific in how we are targeting our supports and our interventions. Now, of course, sensory differences are just one piece of autism. So why are we so interested in that one piece that we are doing so much research at the university and are dedicating a whole session to it today? Well, to answer that question, we need to think about where sensory differences fit into our understanding of autism as a whole. And so you may be familiar with the concept that autism is characterized by these two categories of features, the differences in social communication and interaction, together with the presence of some repetitive behaviors or intense interests. These sensory differences, so that being either more responsive or less responsive to certain sights, sounds, touch, and so on, are also now recognized here in the second category. And as you're listening to these talks today, you may be reflecting on how some of these manifest in your own lives. Because as we just talked about, these sensory differences can be really impactful in people's lives. And I think that that is reason in and of itself to dedicate our energy to understanding these better. But another perhaps equally important thing to remember is that being able to efficiently perceive information that we collect with our senses and to put it all together to interpret social cues are also important. Important for a foundation for how we communicate and interact with other people. And I think this graphic illustrates that a little bit more. Social interaction is really complicated. And this diagram is still pretty simplified, but even so, you can already see how there are multiple building blocks that help us communicate with other people. And sensory processing is one of the very foundations of all of this. So as a first step, we need to be able to take in simple information from what we see or hear, touch or smell. And we put that together with what we pay attention to and what we remember. And we can then use that information to process faces and body language, along with pieces of spoken language. And that gives us some very important tools for interacting with other people. Now, if we change or we shift something about sensory processing, that can potentially have a cascading impact on our social communication. And so the foundations of our sensory processing are really important to understand for those reasons as well. So that was a very quick and broad overview of some of the reasons why we are studying sensory processing and what we are hoping to accomplish. And what I'd like to do next is dive a little bit deeper and look at how we can use neuroscientific tools like electroencephalography or EEG to help us understand those building blocks of sensory processing and social communication. So to illustrate that, we will look at one specific example of work that we've done to try to decipher visual processing in autism using EEG, which you can see that in this picture, there's a participant wearing an EEG cap and a researcher who's connecting the EEG so that we can measure their brain processing. And using that tool, we decided to study how the brain sees body movement. And we were interested in this because we know body movement is such an important way that we communicate emotions, actions, and intentions to other people. And so this led us to the question of whether problems with visual processing of how people move could be related to the social challenges that we see for those on the autism spectrum. And we can study this by showing children videos that we make of dots that look like a person moving. So you can see the man in this picture, and he has bright dots marking all his joints. And what we do is we make these into simpler videos of patterns of moving dots. And we make two types of very short movie clips. I'm going to have it loop here for you continuously so you can see it better. The first types of movies that we showed were short clips of dots that looked like a moving person engaged in some kind of action. The example you see here is a person walking. And then we compared that set of dot movies to a different set where the movement of the dots is scrambled. So here it doesn't look like this is a person moving anymore. It just looks like random dots moving. And we then invited 62 children with and without autism into the lab. They were all between the ages of 7 and 17 years old. And we showed them those videos of moving dots over and over again. And that lets us pull out brain activity that is specific to processing this movement from all the other things that the brain is doing. And we end up with graphs of the brain's electrical activity that's triggered by those videos. And they look something like that brainwave that we can see on the right side of the screen. And we can ask whether that brain activity looks different or the same between children with autism and children with neurotypical development. And the first question we tried to answer then was whether children on the autism spectrum have differences in how their brains automatically process body movement. And to answer that question, while they were wearing the EEG cap and we were measuring the brain activity, we showed the children in our study those videos of moving people or random moving dots. But for this first step, we asked the children just to focus on the color of the dots. And one dot in the picture would either turn red or green, and the children had to just press a button and tell us which color did the dot turn. We didn't tell the children that some of the dots showed moving people. And so they were really not paying attention to that. They were focused more on the color the whole time instead. And what that does is let us see whether the brain's automatic processing of body movement that happens even when children are distracted by another task was intact in autism. These are the color maps that show the EEG data across the whole surface of the head. So to orient us first, we're looking down on the top of the head, and you can see in the top of each of these pictures, the nose on the top and the ears on the side. And the tiny dots are where the EEG electrodes were. Each of these little maps is a snapshot of the brain activity every 50 milliseconds, starting at 100 milliseconds after the dot movie was shown. And the colors show us the difference in the strength of the EEG response to the videos of moving people, minus what the brain response was to just those random dot movies. And that subtraction lets us hone in on processing that is very specific to how the brain is processing body movements, not just how the brain sees any kind of movement. And what we see in children without a developmental disability in this top row are these cool blue colors, which means the videos of the moving people caused a more negative brain response than the random dot movies over the back of the brain, which is where we process visual information. And this tells us that the brains of typically developing children automatically notice when the videos move like people, even when they were focused on the dot color instead. This is the autism group on the second row. And what I find so remarkable every time I look at this data is that whether you are a neuroscientist or not, you can immediately see that the processing looks very different between the two groups. That specialized visual processing of body movement that was represented by those cool blue colors is much weaker, and it happens much later in autism. And for much of the time instead, the brain response almost looks opposite to that of the typically developing group. And so this tells us very clearly that the brains of children on the autism spectrum were not processing the body movement very well when they were focused on the color of the dots. And we are going to talk more about why that may be important. But first, we wanted to know whether paying special attention to the body movements makes the brain better at processing them. And to answer that question, we kept recording the EEG, but after they finished that first task, we played the same set of movies again. This time, though, we did tell them that some of the movies showed a person moving. And we asked them to press a button to tell us, do the dots move like a person or did they not move like a person? So here's the data from the second question that we asked. So we again have those color maps of the brain activity with those typically developing group on the top and the autism again on the bottom row. And the EEG responses now look much more similar between the two groups. And so overall, what we're seeing is that the brains of children on the autism spectrum process the body movement of others quite well if they are paying attention to that question, but their brains did not automatically notice the body movements when they were focused more on the dot color instead. And so, of course, next we wanted to know whether that matters. And thinking back to the pyramid that I showed you in the beginning, we wondered whether the fact that the brain processes body movements differently for children on the autism spectrum was related to their social skills. And so we asked the parents to complete an assessment called the Vineland, which helped us learn about their child's social behaviors in the real world. And what we saw is that the children with the strongest brain responses to the moving people when they were focused specifically on that body movement were rated as having the most adaptive social abilities. And so overall, from this one study, we learned 3 things. We learned that the automatic brain processing of body movement is weaker in autism. But when children were doing a task where they needed to pay attention to the body movements, children with autism process body movements almost the same as their typical peers. And we also saw that the body movement processing may be related to social ability. And one reason that may be important is that a person on the autism spectrum may have a harder time understanding other people if their brains are processing body movements less automatically. They may need to pay extra attention to body language in order to be able to see it. And this is really important because if we think back to our pyramid, if we can understand better the building blocks of social communication and interaction, like how we process body movements and how that might be different in autism, we may be able to use that type of knowledge to help us design better ways to support individuals on the autism spectrum. And so far today, we have given you only one example showing how interactions between our very basic visual processing of dots and attention are very important in autism. But beyond that, there are many more areas that we need to study to fully understand sensory perception in autism. Our brains are doing a lot of work all the time to process sensory information and to make sense of the world around us. And so often, without us even being aware of it, our brains are taking into account our previous sensory experiences and information about the context to decide what sensory inputs do we need to pay attention to, and to help us anticipate what sensory experiences we might get next. And then to integrate or put that together, all the information from our senses into a bigger picture. And that is important in vision, as I just showed you. It's also important for all of our other senses. And so you will hear next from Emily Eisenstein, one of our MD PhD students at University of Rochester, who will be talking about touch processing, followed by Dr. Lawler from the University of Rochester Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience, who will be discussing speech processing. And then you will get to hear from Hannah Peck, one of our OT colleagues, occupational therapy, who will talk about current occupational therapy approaches. And then finally, we have Brian Rogers and colleague who are joining us from Drive On to talk about the very complicated sensory motor task that is learning to drive. And throughout all of these talks, whether we are focusing on real-world challenges such as driving, or the very specific details of how the brain processes sensory information, you'll be able to appreciate first how important sensory processing is. And I think second, that we are fortunate to live in a community here in Rochester where people are looking at this and working on this from a variety of different perspectives and areas of expertise. And that interdisciplinary approach will allow us to understand sensory processing more deeply from the inside out and to apply that knowledge in meaningful ways. So before we move through the rest of the session, I'd like to take just a minute to thank all of the co-investigators and collaborators for that study on visual processing of body movement in autism. And of course, special thanks to the children and families who inspire the work and who participate in the work, without whom, of course, none of this would be possible. As a reminder, questions can be placed in the Q&A and we'll come back to them at the end of the session today. So with that, thank you for your time and attention.
So thank you very much, Emily. That was fascinating. Spanish interpretation, click on the interpreter button at the bottom. Psychologists from U of R, look into the chat. There's a Survey Monkey that you can complete to get credits. I'll play the Skirboll family video at the end of the day. Next on our list is Emily Eisenstein, who's an MD PhD candidate here at the University of Rochester, who's doing some very exciting work. And Emily, would you continue the sensory processing story for us?
All right, thank you. Yep, so I'm going to be focusing now on the sense of touch, and this is my presentation called Getting in Touch with Autism, How We Interact with the Physical World. So as a note, I'm going to be switching back and forth between using identity first and person first language, so autistic versus with autism, because my research participants in the autism community have expressed a range of preferences as far as language. And then I'm also going to use the term neurotypical to indicate people who do not have a neurodevelopmental diagnosis like autism. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to start off with a focus on why touch is important in autism. Then I'm going to move to talk about what we already know about touch and autism. Then I'll discuss a little bit about how we're studying touch here at the University of Rochester. And I'll finish things up with some context on why this research matters. So to start off, why is touch important in autism? So touch is important for a lot of different aspects of development. One aspect is social emotional bonding. So touch is the very first sense to fully develop in a child, and it plays a really critical role in bonding between a child and their caregiver. Touch is also really important in communication, specifically in nonverbal communication. And it's an important way to convey thoughts and emotions without having to verbalize something. Touch is also really critical for self-regulation. So self-stimulatory and soothing behaviors often involve some kind of tactile input. So rubbing one's hands to getting some tapping that can provide some self-regulation. And early on in childhood, the sense of touch is also very important for parental touch as a role in self-regulation and helping an infant to soothe. Touch is also very important for motor planning, as it provides some aspect of the relationship between the self and the physical world and allows people to distinguish between internally and externally generated movement. So then what do we already know about touch in autism? Before I really get into that, I want to divide touch into two categories. The first here is active touch. So that would be me reaching out to touch something else. So it's self-generated, it's dynamic, it's predictable, I'm in control because I'm the one initiating the touch. And in autism, this is often associated with tactile seeking behaviors. So things like rubbing or reaching out to get some kind of tactile input. The other side, there's also passive touch. So that involves something else coming to touch me. So that is externally generated, it's static and unpredictable. And in autism, that can often be associated with tactile avoidance. And it's been shown that these two types, active and passive touch, activate different areas of the brain. So we know that while they use the same kind of biology, different things are going on underneath. So I'll start with a little bit of background information on passive touch, and I'll start with some scientific evidence as a sample of some research that's been done elsewhere. So there have been plenty of caregiver reports of over and under sensitivity to touch in autism, and relating that as well to tactile avoidance. There's also been some self-report, but not quite as much. It's also been shown that autistic people have a greater skin conductance in response to tactile stimulation. So that means they had more emotional or attentional arousal when being touched. Another study found that autism might involve a bigger response to light touch, not necessarily a difference in the detection of it, but just the response when it does occur. So then I'll also touch on a little bit of self-report evidence on passive touch in autism. So on the left here, I have a cartoon that one autistic person shared that kind of shows what types of touch are seen as good versus bad. So the good kind include some weighted blankets or some fidgets that they could, play with on their own time and control. Whereas things that are unexpected or messy and uncontrollable were seen as bad. And on the right, I have some quotes here taken from some articles or blogs written by autistic people. The first one says, "I'm taken out of the moment for however long the sensation lasts." And the second says, "I will feel actual rage if someone strokes me or touches me very lightly." So overall, passive touch can have these negative connotations in autism. Switching now to active touch. As far as the scientific evidence, there's really not as much here, but it has been shown that autistic people are better at picking how an object should look based on how it feels. So using that tactile input, they're able to create a mental image in a better way. Then there's also been some research showing that higher levels of tactile seeking are associated with greater social differences and more repetitive behaviors. So this tactile seeking and active touch has been shown to play this kind of critical relationship with key features of autism. Overall, though, we know very little about active touch in autism. Again, going back to the self-report on the left here, I have a sample of some kind of these fidget toys that people often use to get that tactile input. And on the right, I have some more quotes. The first says, touching these textures gives me a feeling of calm, peace, and joy. While the second says, stroking this ear of this dog with my finger and feeling the tactile sense keeps me a bit more grounded and aware of my body so that it doesn't seem so far away. So then why is active touch so hard to study? There's a couple different reasons. The first is that by nature, active touch involves movement. So someone needs to be moving in order to reach out and touch something. And this movement creates inherent challenges for a lot of the techniques that we usually use to study the brain, like MRI or EEG. We also need to be able to measure what's happening when that person is moving, which can be a challenge without a lot of equipment. And then finally, active touch is also very interactive. There needs to be something tangible for someone to touch. They can't just be, waving their hand through the air, because then there's not actually any physical contact happening. So then how are we studying touch here at the University of Rochester? Similar to what Dr. Knight talked about before, I am using electroencephalography, or EEG, to measure when and to what degree brains can respond to specific things. So my research specifically focuses on how the brain responds to different types of vibrations on the fingertip. And just as context, all the research I talk about from this point on that is my own has been done with neurotypical and autistic adults between the ages of 18 and 45. So the first research that I'll talk about deals with the detection of vibrations. So on the right, you can see this waveform here that represents how the brain has responded to vibrations that occur at time 0 there. So as you can see, pretty early on, there's this negative activity that is believed to represent basic detection of sensory stimuli. So the brain's detection that, yes, there was indeed a vibration happening. And what we have found so far is that there's no difference between the groups in that early negative activity. Later on, though, in that positive activity you see there in the green circle, there is some difference emerging between the two groups. So that later positive activity is meant to represent the amount of cognitive resources that are devoted to a task, in this case, processing the vibration. And we do see that it is larger in the autism group than the neurotypical group, suggesting that the autism group on the whole have used a larger amount of cognitive resources to process the vibration. So then moving to a second part of this study that deals with the detection of unexpected vibrations. So we introduced this element where the majority of the vibrations were a short duration and the minority were a longer duration. So as you can see on the right, we see slightly different responses in the brain to those frequent and those rare vibrations, where the rare ones tend to get a bigger response because the brain has kind of built up this pattern of what it's going to expect. And when something defies that expectation, it's more surprising and we get that bigger response. And what's cool about this type of project is that this does not depend on attention or participation, so anyone can do it as long as they can wear the EEG cap. So then, do neurotypical and autistic people differ in how they respond to unexpected vibrations? So you see in these two images, the yellow highlighted area is where we're focusing on. And overall, we don't see differences between the groups at this point in the research. So they tend to have that similar response to those unexpected vibrations. So putting this together, this suggests that adults with autism recognize predicted and unpredicted vibrations in the same way as neurotypical adults, but may devote more brain resources to doing so. But wait, this experiment could only show us how the brain reacts when people are not paying attention to the touch and also not in control of the touch. So how can we study active self-generated touch? So the way that we have approached this is by using virtual reality with an Oculus Quest. So this technology, it's mobile, it's also interactive, so we can have different shapes and things that people can interact with. We can also have three-dimensional visual presentation of objects that people can interact with. It's also Bluetooth capable, so we can connect it with a lot of other technology. And it also has built-in hand tracking capabilities that allow us to track where people are moving. So putting it all together, we use EEG to record brain activity. We use that haptic feedback again to provide a vibration to provide that tactile experience. And then we're using virtual reality to provide that visual feedback that allows people to see when the tactile sensation is going to happen. So within this experiment, there are two conditions, a passive and an active condition. In the passive one, there is a virtual shape that begins and then moves to touch a virtual rendering of someone's hand. And when the two touch, the person feels a vibration on the fingertip. In the active condition, they see the exact same thing, but in this case, the virtual rendering of a hand, they'll reach out to touch the shape, and when that finally makes contact with the shape, that's when they feel the vibration. So the passive condition is externally initiated, and the active condition is self-initiated. So again, putting it all together, we have EEG measuring the brain activity, the vibrations on the fingertip to provide a tactile experience, and then both a passive and an active condition presented in the virtual reality. So just to give you kind of a taste of how this looks, in the passive condition, the shape is moving to touch the person's hand. Whereas in the active condition, the person moves to touch the shape. And outside of virtual reality, they are receiving the vibrations on the fingertip whenever the hand touches that pink ball. So this project is really very new. We've only collected a little bit of data so far, so I really don't have any conclusions at this stage. But as you can see by these graphs on the left and the right, we see the same basic shapes that we saw with the original tactile task that I was explaining. So we really are seeing very robust results. We see, negative activity followed by positive activity. And that's really encouraging to us. And we're really excited about what this can show us once we have more people enrolled. So using this, we can separate out predictable and unpredictable touch, and also self-initiated and externally initiated touch. So finally, why does this research matter? So I'll talk a little bit about what these results will help us understand. The first thing is that they can help us understand the underlying mechanism behind abnormal tactile sensitivity in autism. So using these EEG waveforms, we're able to see if the brain has a hyper or hypo reactivity to certain types of touch. It'll also show us how people with autism initially process tactile information in the brain. So this EEG can really show us exactly how the brain is responding to that very first detection of the vibrations. We'll also learn about whether autistic adults process active and passive touch differently from neurotypical adults, as well as how the predictability of touch affects how it is processed. So we hope that this kind of research will have a big impact. We hope that by understanding active and passive touch and how those can play into different sensory sensitivities, that this can lead to the design of better adaptations to accommodate sensory preferences in different populations. We also hope that this can help us move towards the destigmatization of self-stimulatory behaviors, or stimming. So these self-stimulatory behaviors are derived from active touch, And if we're able to show that different things are happening in the brain and that there is this tangible biological self-regulation that's going on with active touch, and we hope that that will help destigmatize these self-stimulatory behaviors. And then as a pretty far off goal, because it's relatively far removed from this very early research, we also hope to understand more about self-injurious behaviors, which is kind of the extreme of active touch. And hopefully this kind of research will help us develop ways to provide safer alternatives to self-injurious behaviors. So these are the citations of all the research that I talked about earlier. And just to end with a thank you for all of my mentors, all the folks in the lab who helped, and of course, all of the participants who volunteered for this research along the way.
So thank you, Emily. That was fabulous. And for those of you who have personal experience with autism in the audience, you're seeing really how scientists are thinking about the differences in visual perception, the differences in tactile perception, and how that might translate into real life experiences. Next, Dr. Ed Lawler is going to take us through auditory perception. And I'm very personally excited. Dr. Lawler is an associate professor in neuroscience and bioengineering here at the University of Rochester. Dr. Lawler.
Great, thank you. Let me just share my screen. I also want to make sure I can share some sounds because I have a couple of fun sounds in here that I'd like to share with people. So, okay, hopefully you're seeing my full screen now. So what I'd like to talk about today is along very much the same theme as we've heard in the previous two talks about sensory perception sensory processing in people with autism, but specifically in the context of the processing of natural speech. And I'm going to kind of throw an extra bit of complication into the consideration of sensory processing here by challenging the kind of classic model of sensory processing, which is the following. It suggests that we have eyes and ears, as we do, that receive sensory input from the outside world, and that information flows in to our brains via our eyes and ears and up into our brain so that our brain can then make sense of what it is that we're seeing and hearing. And this is the classic textbook view of sensory processing. And it's not to say that this is not correct, because obviously this information does flow in through these channels, but rather to suggest that this consideration of the system is incomplete. In recent years, significant evidence has been brought to bear to suggest that there's a whole other story at play here at the same time, which is that we have brains, human brains, that have evolved and developed through evolution and learning to very much be relevant to the kind of behaviors that we as human beings engage in. So one way I like to describe this is to say that, you know, our brains, for example, don't allow us to see the full, unadulterated truth of the world around us. For example, we cannot see infrared light, we cannot see ultraviolet light. They don't allow us to do certain things that other animals can do, like use sonar or understand what it's like to operate at the bottom of the ocean. So we very much have human brains that allow us to be sensitive to the kinds of things that human beings encounter in our daily lives, being kind of the size that we are, with hands and creatures that walk, etc. And as part of that, we have a brain that has become wired up through evolution and learning to embody the statistics of the world that are relevant to us as human beings, that allow us to see and hear human things. And because of this idea, the thinking is that our sensory processing of the world is very much a balance between us receiving the input from the outside world, what we see and what we hear, with what we already know, so to speak, what's already known about the human world that's embodied and wired into our brains, like I say, through evolution and learning. And in fact, one extreme example of this is the notion that our brains are essentially prediction machines that are at all times predicting the environment that we're operating in, and that are cross-checking those predictions against the sensory input that we receive in order to actually perceive the world around us. So in some ways, this is most easily demonstrated through a couple of examples. So the first one I'll show is the following famous checkerboard. So if I show you this checkerboard pattern and I point you to square A and square B, and I ask you to consider the brightness of those squares, you might be surprised for me to then tell you that the color underneath the A here and the color underneath the B are in fact the exact same color gray. So if I had Photoshop open now, for example, I could do the little eyedropper tool and show you that these two gray colors are in fact exactly the same. So why don't they appear the same to us? They don't appear the same to us because our brains are not just, dumbly following what our eyes are receiving, but rather our brains are using our knowledge of the world combined with what our eyes are receiving to infer what is probably going on in this checkerboard, which is that probably in real life, B is actually brighter than A. It's just in a shadow, so it appears darker. And even though I've told that to you right now and explained that that's what's actually going on, that the B square and the A square are in fact the same color, you still can't help but see B as looking brighter than A, because like I say, it's kind of hardwired into the wiring of our brain that we do this kind of merger of sensory input with our prior knowledge of the world. And what my lab is interested in is in the processing of speech and language, in particular natural speech and language, and considering this question of how prediction in the perception of speech and language might actually operate in the human brain. Going back to the very nice framework that Dr. Knight introduced in her first talk about the idea that sensory processing in some ways represents a very fundamental aspect of our operation in daily life. If there's impairments in sensory processing, these can have knock-on effects on our ability to process language and meaning and to struggle in communication and social settings. So I very much think of a very similar framework where I'm particularly focused on these three kind of ideas over to the right-hand side, how sensory processing and sensory processing impairments might impact upon people's ability to understand and process language, and how that again might have knock-on effects on people's ability to operate in social settings. But again, rather than just thinking of sensory processing as information flowing up through the sensory system and us making sense of it, I also want us to consider the idea that our predictions and our knowledge about social settings, our knowledge of the world, will actually also feed back down the system to merge with that sensory input in order for us to properly perceive the world. I'd like to give one more example of this notion of of predictive processing, specifically in the context of language. So what I'm going to do is try a little experiment here. I'm going to play some sounds and hope they work over Zoom. This is an experiment that we did several years ago where we degraded speech. We made the speech very hard to understand by degrading it using a technique called noise vocoding. And we played it to healthy neurotypical adults in a standard kind of neuroscience experiment. This was several years before we started working with autistic people. So I'm going to play an example of this degraded speech, and if your speakers are turned up, you'll hear it, but I expect that you will not be able to understand it because we've degraded it so badly. It's a short excerpt from the book, The Old Man and the Sea. So I'm hoping people were able to hear that. Maybe we can see some. So I'll play it one more time. And again, you may struggle to understand it. Okay, so now I'm going to play the clean version, which is a bit where the old man has captured a fish and he's bringing the fish back to the market and he's wondering,
what will he bring in the market if the flesh is good? What will he bring in the market if the flesh is good?
And now if I play the degraded version again, so I'm hoping there in this case, you were able to actually perceive the speech now in this degraded signal, which you weren't able to do in the first place, because again, perception is not just the bottom-up information going into your system. It's combining that bottom-up sensory input with your knowledge and predictions about the world. And because I manipulated your knowledge of the world by telling you what you were going to hear, suddenly you were able to hear it. And so this is the kind of thing that we're interested in doing in my team, and we think might have important utility in the context of certain populations in whom we think predictive perception might be altered. So again, we infer the causes of our sensory input. We're trying to understand what our sensory input is by combining that sensory input with what we already know about the world. If we get if we have some knowledge of the world already, depicted in purple here, and we get some sensory input that might be kind of noisy, like that noisy speech that I just presented to you, you can still perceive that speech by combining the noisy input with what you knew about the world already. This is the big idea, and it's quite a fundamental challenge to neuroscience that's become quite a hot topic in rethinking how this classic model of perception works in the human brain. And also importantly for today's discussion, we think that this may be altered. This idea of merging the sensory input with our prior knowledge of the world might be altered in certain populations, in particular, people with autism, and perhaps also people with schizophrenia. And so what we think may be going on here is that because of changes in synaptic connectivity or wiring of the brain more generally, people with autism or people with schizophrenia may be using their model of the world too much or too little when trying to perceive the world around them. In the context of autism, we think this might explain in some cases why some autistic people have enhanced sensitivity to certain sensory inputs, why they might struggle to process certain sensory inputs in the context of the environment that they happen to be in, why they might use things like stimming, for example, which is a thing that they can predict, a sensory input that they can then predict rather than an external stimulus, which they might find harder to predict, why they might engage in certain repetitive behaviors because, again, they are more predictable. And so we think, just as a counter to this, we think that in schizophrenia, it might be quite the opposite situation where patients with schizophrenia might be overly relying on their model of the world, their prior knowledge of the world when trying to perceive the world, and in fact, maybe creating their own auditory hallucinations, predicting voices into existence that don't, in fact, aren't actually out there in the real world. So we were awarded, based on our previous research in neurotypical adults, we were awarded an award by the Safari Foundation, the Simons Foundation, to start to investigate some of these questions about predictive speech processing in autism, using one of their pilot grants just about 2 years ago. And so the grant has been a little slow moving because of COVID last winter, but we've made some good progress, and we're not finished, and I can tell you about our progress so far today. So once again, much like the two previous studies, and because of its utility for speech processing in general, we are also using EEG here. EEG is an electrical, method to record electrical brain signals that fluctuate quite quickly. This is important because when you're studying natural speech, people speak fairly quickly. The speech signal changes several times per second. So you need a brain signal that can track quite quickly with the speed of natural speech. And in fact, it turns out that this technology is really useful for speech because of the following phenomenon. When I record EEG brainwave signals, they fluctuate, like I say, very rapidly, tracking the electrical activity of the brain. And it turns out that these fluctuations in the EEG signal actually correlate and track along with fluctuations in the speech energy. So as the speech is getting louder and quieter naturally across the syllables and words that I'm saying, we can see signatures of that energy fluctuations coming across in the EEG data. And so my lab has learned to quantify this and to come up with numbers that reflect how strongly the EEG signal is capturing the sensory processing, the acoustic processing of this speech. So that's the acoustic processing of the speech, but how does this feed back into this prediction story that I've been talking about? I want to know how this sensory input, this acoustic processing that's coming into the brain, is affected by predictions. How are people using this predictive knowledge of the world to alter that sensory processing that's coming in? How are those things merging? So we think natural speech is a great way to do this because there's lots of predictions just naturally built into ordinary everyday speech. For example, if I show you the following sentence, I take my coffee with cream and, you probably have quite a strong prediction as to what I might say next. I might say sugar. I don't know what else I might say. Some people might have some strange tastes, but that's one strong predicting sentence that you might hear. Another one, for example, is the dentist told me to brush my. Again, your brain now has generated a strong prediction of what I'm about to say that might affect how you're actually going to hear that word. Other sentences are different. For example, if I say, yesterday on my way to work, I saw a You have no idea what I saw on my way to work yesterday. You don't have a very good prediction in this case. Or if I said recently I read a book about, and again, very hard to predict what I'm going to say next. So in natural speech, the amount of predictability of every upcoming word varies according to the context of the speech that you've just heard. Sometimes you'll have a strong prediction, sometimes you won't. And we're interested to know how the strength of that prediction affects how you hear that next word that comes up. A couple of years ago, we published a study showing that it was possible that these EEG signals, in fact, did vary. The strength with which the EEG tracked the auditory signal varied as a function of how predictable the upcoming word was. Again, this was a neuroscience study that I did before I ever started working with autistic people. This was a study in neurotypical adults where we just showed that the stronger prediction you had for the upcoming word, the weaker your auditory system seemed to encode the sounds of that word. So this is depicted just in a cartoon format here on this slide. The less predictable a word was, the stronger your auditory response was to that word. And again, this seems to be to us to be a very nice measure of this merging process of the knowledge of the world predictions with the sensory input. And again, this has been proposed to be altered in autism and schizophrenia and is the basis of our Safari grant to study it in people with autism. Okay, so our particular experiment, we're not going to degrade the speech quite as badly as we did in that example I showed you. We're more interested in studying speech without providing you direct clues. We want to study speech in a more naturalistic way. So what we're doing is we're playing audiobooks for people in different levels of background noise. So for example, here's just a short excerpt from an audiobook that is played in quiet.
Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and...
Okay, you get the idea. And then we play it in a little bit more noise.
If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year.
But again, you can understand hopefully that quite well. And then we play it in quite a bit more noise.
Only her mother could talk about him in a natural way, saying, when your father gets back.
And our idea here is that when you're listening to speech in noise, in order to understand the speech, you might be more likely to rely even more on your context and predictions in order to understand the speech that's happening. So we wanted to see if we could see alterations in how strongly people were relying on their predictions to perceive speech.
If you don't...
Excuse me. And so the first aim of our grant was entirely based on research in neurotypical adults. We wanted to, first of all, to establish that these measures were doing what these brain measures were doing, what we thought they were doing, so that we could get a good feel for how they represented what we were manipulating in our experiment, so that with more confidence, then we could go and take those brain measurements forward into a second aim focused on people with autism. So our first aim, like I say, we had 25 neurotypical adults. We played them speech. This down the bottom on this axis here is just showing different levels of background noise. As the speech gets noisier and noisier and noisier going this direction, people rate it as less and less and less intelligible, so which makes sense. They can understand everything over here. They can understand very little over here once there's a lot of noise. We also asked these folks to answer some comprehension questions at the end of every block or something. We'd let them listen for about a minute and then ask them some comprehension questions on what they were understanding. And again, when the speech is quiet or just in a small amount of noise, they can understand quite a lot of it. And as soon as the speech gets very noisy, they start to struggle to understand what's going on. We also found that our EEG measures, just the acoustic tracking of that speech energy that I talked about, the EEG seems to track quite nicely with the speech that they're hearing. Again, it goes down a little bit as the speech gets noisy, which makes sense. But the key result we were looking for was, are people using these predictions? Are people using the predictability of the upcoming word to modulate how their auditory system actually hears those words? And the evidence suggests, yes, it is. So we find that in quiet and noise where people can hear the speech and understand the context, they are using that context to predict the upcoming word. And that is modulating the fact that these numbers are large and positive, well, relatively large and positive, suggests that they are using that context to alter how they're actually hearing those words. This, again, tapers off as the speech gets noisy, because up here you can't understand it very well. You can't really use your predictions anymore because you're not really understanding most of the speech. Then in our second aim, we turned our attention to people with autism. And in particular, we were focused on people whose language has more or less stabilized. We were dealing with high functioning folks with good language skills. We want to make sure that our experiment isn't just picking up on language impairment specifically, but most especially on in picking up on differences that may be there based on autism. And so we have to make sure that our participants have good language skills in general in order to find the differences that are specifically related to the autism diagnosis and not to their language differences. So we have been recruiting folks aged between 14 and 21. Again, the study was a little delayed in the first place because of COVID the first year, but we're making good progress now and have recruited 9 individuals for this second aim so far, 3 neurotypical adults, 3 adults with the diagnosis of autism, and 3 autistic adolescents aged between 14 and 17. Once again, they listen to speech in different levels of noise. We trimmed the experiment down just to make it only 3 different levels. And again, as it gets a little noisier, the numbers are starting to fall off a little bit in how much people can understand. And again, their comprehension scores tend to fall off. Again, this is only small numbers. There's only 3 people in each of these colored bars. So I don't want to overinterpret things. But it may be that the yellow bars are maybe a shade lower. These are the adults with autism who may be struggling slightly more to understand the story in this case. But for all subjects, the EEG, again, is tracking quite well with the acoustic energy of the speech. All of these bars, maybe again, the yellow is a little lower. I don't want to overinterpret. There's still only 3 people here in each data set. But the EEG seems to be nicely tracking along with the acoustic energy of the speech. The big question is that acoustic energy, again, being modulated by how well you can predict the upcoming words? So for all subjects, does seem to be some use of predictive context in modulating the acoustic input. It does seem, though, so far, and again, it's only small numbers, to be quite strong in the neurotypical adults, and perhaps somewhat weaker in the adults with autism and the autistic adolescents. And so again, this is preliminary, but it's early evidence that people with autism may not be using their prior knowledge of the world and their ability, the context of the situation to predict their sensory input quite as strongly as people, as neurotypical adults might be doing. It's very preliminary, but it's quite exciting. It's along the lines of the hypothesis we had all along. And I'll just have to maybe come back again next year with the full data set to show you all how it's all turned out. So in summary, we argue that perception is not just dumbly telling your brain what your eyes and ears are hearing, but rather involves merging that sensory information with what we already know about the world that's kind of baked into our hardwired brains. And that we think there might be differences in this predictive perception, and that in autism and also perhaps in schizophrenia. We have a parallel line of research in that domain also. We know that natural speech involves predictions as you're listening to it. We know that EEG tracks the acoustics of speech. And so the question was, does the predictability of words alter the acoustic processing of speech? We show that it does in neurotypical adults. And so far, although it's early, we think that it may do so less in people with autism, which would fit with our hypothesis and is something that we need to confirm with more data. And I would just like to thank several of my collaborators, and I've highlighted one of my graduate students who's been doing a tremendous amount of work on this project, as well as one of the research technicians in my team who's been instrumental to this work, as well as the Simons Foundation, and to all of you for tuning in. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So as all of you have heard, there's a tremendous amount of basic science and understanding of the brain that goes into sensory processing. Most of the audience who are parents, self-advocates, and clinicians will be much more familiar with the language that Hannah's going to use. But as Hannah and then Brian talked to us about how we use sensory processing in our daily lives and in treatment, keep in the back of your mind, that was really not a pun, keep in the front of your mind what Drs. Knight, Eisenstein, and Lila have been talking about, because this is really what underlies what Hannah and Brian are going to be sharing with us. So Hannah.
Great, thank you. Let me just get it going here. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the practical approaches to sensory processing. So I hope that this really ties together everything that we've heard so far today. So occupational therapy is a pretty broad field. We're all over the place, and many people don't know exactly what we do, but our job at the very bottom line of an OT is to treat any dysfunction that impacts occupations and quality of life. So here we have this meme where a lot of people will say like, oh, occupation, so that helps you get a job, right? But we really look at just any piece that could be impacting day-to-day function, and we treat that. In the 1970s, OT started to realize the impact of sensory processing dysfunction, specifically associated with autism. Different theories and frameworks have been created to help guide our practice. And overall, sensory processing is a huge topic, but we're going to cram it in 20 minutes with the following objectives. So I'm hoping that we can sort out all the terms that you hear in relation to sensory processing, understanding how sensory processing skills impact day-to-day function, understanding when there's difficulties, how that impacts function, and hopefully come out of here with a practical approach when we're dealing with sensory processing difficulties. So the first term that we'll talk about is sensory processing. So this is our ability to take in information from our environment and our own body and make it into useful information. So vision is how we perceive or interpret our surroundings. Hearing or auditory is how we detect, locate, and identify sounds in the environment. Smells, we can recognize smells using the chemical receptors in our nose. Taste, we can detect differences between salty, sour, bitter, and savory. Touch, or our tactile sense, is how we perceive pressure, temperature, traction, and pain. Movement, or vestibular sense, is our balance, motion, and our spatial orientation. So this helps us know when we're upright or how far we are away from upright. Body awareness, or proprioceptive input, is our ability to locate ourselves in our extremities in space. And lastly, our internal sensations, or interoception, is how we recognize our internal cues. So this includes things like thirst, hunger, exhaustion, pain, even urinating or bowel movements. So our neurological system is constantly working to take in the stimuli, and this is how we experience our world. So the next piece to know is sensory integration. So this is similar to what we saw. Whoops, let me go back here. Similar to what we saw in the pyramids before, this just breaks it down a little bit more and has a tad bit more of a motor focus. So sensory integration is the ability to take the information from our own body and our environment and turn it into the skills that we need to interact with our world. So the example I'll use is, think about a baby on a floor. The baby's starting to feel the different textures of the hardwood or the rug through their tactile sense. They're learning how close they are to the ground with their proprioceptive sense. And they're beginning to understand what it feels like to roll or to go up and down through their vestibular sense. The baby's brain is taking in all this information and now making a plan for how much muscle tension it's needed and how to stay upright to get on its hands and knees. Once that's mastered, it's going to kind of move up this pyramid and start making a motor plan to move the arms and legs in a reciprocal pattern. So now we have a baby crawling and exploring their environment and having new opportunities to create new behaviors, as if you have a baby at home, you know that comes next. And learning, that's how we explore and learn from our environment. The next term that you probably hear constantly is modulation and regulation. Modulation of sensory input is the ability to recognize important information and tune out non-essential information. Regulation is the ability to maintain that input for optimal arousal. So if we're not receiving enough information from our bodies and environment, then we have low arousal. Obviously, there's times where this is necessary, so we have to decrease our arousal or stimuli in order to fall asleep at night. We need to add stimuli when we're waking up. So you might turn on the lights, get a taste of coffee, do some exercise to get to a point where you can really attend and focus. If you have too much stimuli, Our bodies often perceive that as a stress response, and you might go into that fight, flight, or freeze. We know that's not the optimal way of learning. There are times where you might decide you need a little stress or anxiety to get something done, like getting this presentation done. I kind of needed to put extra deadlines on myself to create that stress to get in a focus mode and get this done. So this is important because we know through our literature that 90%, and I've even read up to 98% of children with autism have difficulties with sensory processing. So that is not substantial. So what do we think about sensory processing difficulties? So in OT, we can assess the difficulties and can categorize them based on how it's impacting our brains and our ability to integrate the information. So we think about these 4 categories. For low registration, we might see kids who appear uninterested, have low endurance, and often miss information in their environment. So these kids tend to have a higher neurological threshold as well. So they're just kind of missing the cues around them. The kids that are sensory seeking have a high neurological threshold. They tend to be more active and impulsive and often motorically disorganized. The kids that are sensory avoiding do what they can to limit their exposures to stimuli. So they avoid meeting that sensory threshold, so they don't want to get there. And we often associate emotional reactivity with the kids who fit in this category. The kids who tend to be more on the sensitive side or have the sensory sensitivities find that the sensations that, if you're neurotypical, usually can recognize as normal stimuli. Kids in the sensitivity category often find that overwhelming. So we think of this as having a low neurological threshold, and we have more of the fight, flight, or freeze. Of course, it's never as easy to say that one kid fits in one of these categories all the time. So we have to think about this sense by sense and even situation by situation. So as we've discussed so far, when we have difficulties in sensory processing, it can really impact many domains in life. What we hear a lot in occupational therapy is that kids with sensory processing difficulties have decreased initiation of social contact. They can be picky eaters, and that leads to poor nutrition. We have poor focus or perceived as poor focusing, increased activity levels, difficulty with daily tasks like teeth brushing, getting dressed, showering, poor transition abilities. We might hear a passive personality, or conversely, being perceived as being intense or making others feel uncomfortable. We often hear families talk about difficulty with their family outings, or difficulty participating in what we would think as typical leisure activities like sports and clubs. We might associate self-interest behaviors or repetitive behaviors with sensory difficulties. Emotionally reactive children, we might hear inconsistent pain responses and also bowel and bladder dysfunction. So I'm certain that parents, educators, and other professionals in the audience can certainly add to this list, but this is just a composite. When I ask the other OTs that I work with, like, what are the top ones? These are some of the most common that we hear and think about in our day-to-day at work. So now what? When we have a sensory processing difficulty, it can be overwhelming, right? We have to think about all the senses all at once, but I like to break it down to the ABCs that we've learned in different behavioral therapies. So the first step is to think about the behaviors. So let's pretend, as an example, you and your child are on your way to your OT appointment. You get checked in and your child's waiting patiently. 5 minutes go by and he starts feeling a little agitated or uncomfortable. And then another minute goes by and you start seeing some tears, and that quickly moves to a tantrum with some hitting, kicking, laying on the floor. And this has happened for the last 2 sessions. So now we have a pattern of behaviors. Eventually you decide to leave the situation and it's too difficult. So you're just going to try again next week before the session has started. So that's what we see. That's what happens. And that's the difficult part in the day. But we have to think about what might have happened before. So just some obvious examples or potential examples, we could think about the visual sense. So were there fluorescent lights? Was it loud and crowded? Maybe a baby crying. My kids who come to see me in outpatient are often a little nervous if they see a baby in the waiting room. Now with the weather changing, if they're still in their winter coat and not necessarily wanting to take it off, but then become overheated, visually and motorically, it might be hard to get through the waiting room, thinking about the motor plan to get from point A to point B. So all of those things can be very difficult when we have sensory processing differences involved. And then we have to think about what happened after. So they might feel sad that they missed out or guilty that they didn't do the expected behavior. We're now dealing with a new transition. And we have to think about, was this behavior positively or negatively reinforced, or did the behavior meet a sensory need that they were trying to get to? So hopefully those examples made sense, but what we think about in OT is the sensory integration theory. So our job is to engineer and adjust the sensory qualities in the child's environment to promote self-direction and play while facilitating adaptive responses in motor, affective, social, language, and cognitive areas. So we're going to do this by modifying or adapting. So that's changing the task for the individual. So the expectation changes in order to get through. We might accommodate, so maybe the task or the end goal doesn't change, but how we get there or the tools that we use to get there can change for the child. Or rehabilitate. So in this context, that means working on the neurological system to make changes to better tolerate the stimuli or learn the skills to better modulate the stimuli that they're experiencing. So what can you do as the adult in the life of a child having any issues with sensory processing? We're going to go back through the ABCs of behaviors, but this time start with the antecedents. So we know that there might be a pattern of behaviors, but in the antecedents, what changes can you make to make this more successful? So you might do something to modify the environment. Think about planning prior to a session coming in. Are there changes that you can make for the waiting room, or different planning that you can do, or where you sit in the waiting room to accommodate? Maybe something like noise canceling headphones or sunglasses might be helpful, or challenge. It might be time where it's more appropriate to challenge the difficulty. Or practice the skill before you go into the situation. If the behavior occurs, we could do things like decreasing the stimuli in the moment, provide calming input like deep pressure or even vibration, or use distraction with special interest when possible. And then we have to think about how we deal with after the fact. So if it went well and we move through the situation or the difficulty in a positive way, we can highlight that we maintain that participation. You learned a coping skill. Everyone usually feels better by the end. You made it to your task and learned the skill associated with that task. And then we had an instant where your brain decides like, yeah, I can handle that situation. I can handle that stimuli. I made a positive connection. And I know that this can be overwhelming. So in OT, in our outpatient clinic, we often use the word toolbox. So we want parents and kids to feel like they have a plethora of skills or resources to go about their different difficulties that they might feel throughout the day. So I start with what the actual problem is that you want to address. So in this example, a parent might say, my child cries every morning putting their clothes on for school. I'm sure you can picture how this can spiral into needing to change clothes more frequently, taking longer to get out the door, late for school, and so on and so forth. The next step is to think about how that sensory processing difficulty is impacting function and what the sensory contribution to the behavior is. So this child has learned through their experiences that some clothes can feel itchy, restricting, and uncomfortable. So it started with a sensory sensitivity, but they've moved into that sensory avoiding category. Then we have to think about what strategies would be effective to address this difficulty. It might be strategies that we use in the antecedent or during the behavior, or consequences that might be positive for the child. So for example, you could decide to buy different clothing that might be more comfortable. We could do something like a sensory strategy, such as heavy work before, during, or after. You could practice in low stress times of experiencing the sensation and making a new positive connection with that tactile sense. And then when it does go successfully, we could use positive reinforcement to further that pattern of success. And of course, it's never as easy to say that one strategy is going to work 100% of the time. So it always takes trial and error. So you're going to try a variety of strategies and decide what works best for you. A sensory strategy is only as good as you can enforce it. So it needs to be practical for everyone in the household, and it needs to make sense and be rewarding for both you and your child. Lastly, I just want to leave you with some different ideas of ways to accommodate and modify both in the home and community as well as school. So when we're thinking about being in the home or out in the community, getting involved in physical activities, a lot of our kids need movement. They need the vestibular and proprioceptive input. At home, thinking about ways to provide opportunities for vestibular input, like spinning, swinging, being in different positions. Encouraging lots of tactile play throughout the day. Create spaces for decreased stimuli like burrowing spaces or cozy corners. Work movement and calming strategies just right into your daily tasks. We could think about using timers, stopwatch, or playlists as auditory and visual cues to give to the kids with low registration who need a little bit more to process when something is done and moving on to the next. We can prepare for transitions. This is particularly helpful for the kids with sensitivities, who when they perceive the new sensation, they think of that as an insult to their neurological system. So we might have that anxious response with fight or flight or freeze. And then last is sensory diets. You might see a lot online regarding sensory diets, but just breaking it down really simply, a sensory diet is picking sensory-rich activities and having the child do the task at various points through the day. I promise you that it does not have to be every 1.5 hours on the dot. You can make it work for you. I like to think about things that would be involved in the child's day anyway. So you're going to eat breakfast. That might be a good time for a sensory-rich activity. You're going to change your clothes, that might be a good time, lunchtime, nap time, etc. At school, I often advocate that recess is not taken away from a child. Kids need the opportunity for movement to meet their sensory needs and meet the thresholds that they need throughout the day. There might be options for mobile seating devices like a therapy ball or a wiggle stool, anything along those lines. We want to make sure our kids with autism have opportunities for visual and kinesthetic learning along with the auditory input, because we know that if their threshold is not where we want it to be, they're missing that information. We might think of the oral and tactile sense with chew and fidget toys. Next, allow kids to work in various positions, provide opportunities for heavy work activities and calisthenic breaks. Preparing students for transitions, give noise canceling opportunities, and create opportunities to reduce the sensory load. And so similar to home, having calming spaces for kids to move to. So that is my talk for today. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate everyone being here.
So thank you, Hannah. And I forgot to tell everyone that you're the Director of Outpatient Occupational Therapy for Pediatrics at Strong. So Hannah has talked to us about the sensory processing evaluation and treatment in younger children. And I'm really excited to hear from Brian Rogers and colleagues at Drive On about the ultimate challenge to sensory processing, which is driving. With no further ado, Brian Rogers is a senior certified driving rehab specialist. He's here with colleagues, and we're all ears.
Hello, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I believe Sam is our screen slider today. So she'll be doing our slides because we have a little technical issue today. So thanks for that. What we do, me and Pete, as mentioned, we are driver rehabilitation specialists. It does come with a certification where after you do the job for a few years, you can take your test, become certified. My background has nothing to do with this job. I've been here 13 years. My bachelor's degree is in communications. Peter, however, is a COTA. So he's a little more, had been educated for this field a little more than I was, but here we are. Most people in this field are OTs and OTAs and those types. So what me and Pete do is we do work with pretty much anyone with any type of disability or medical condition that needs help driving, but quite a big population of the people we work with are people with autism. I always kind of like to say that it is my favorite group of people to work with. This job can be very satisfying in many ways, but when working with someone with autism, you have to always find sometimes some new and interesting ways to convey your information, to have them understand what you're trying to teach them. So they end up teaching me, as a teacher, a lot of different ways to convey information to all the different people. Because their brains and the way they look at driving in the world in general is so unique individually, we actually can learn a lot from them too. So if you want to go to the next slide. Basically, what we do when someone comes in, typically it's a younger person with autism, but it's broken down in two parts. So our first part is the clinical assessment, which Peter is going to talk to for a while about. And he'll go over a lot of the different assessments and exercises we do, which is basically to try to get a window into how their brain is working and how they learn better. And then I'll speak a little bit more into what we do when we're in the actual vehicle, behind the wheel, as we call it, and some of our communication techniques when we're doing that. So I'll kind of kick it over to Pete.
You can go to the next slide, if you would, please. So basically, when we bring in a student for the first time, we do what's called a clinical evaluation. And we use that kind of to get to know that person as best we can. So we look at three main factors there. One is your vision, two being physical skills and functioning, and then more importantly, the more wide, the bigger aspect really of it is the cognition and executive function. But as we're doing that, as we're doing all of those, we're also kind of looking at, as soon as we meet them, kind of what, their emotional regulation, their insight and awareness as well as like sensory processing as well. We kind of get a picture of that as we, as we meet them. Go ahead and go over 3 slides, actually, if you would. You know what? Make that 4. These other slides kind of aren't part of the part 1 at all. And then this one's more of what we do with older drivers as well. So unfortunately, I'm going to make you go over 2 more slides. That's good. Okay. So our newer drivers, that's where these students are going to fall under. And again, so when we're talking about the autism population there, we're not so much concerned with a lot of the physical factors as much as we are that cognition. And then one more slide for me. So with our part 1 clinical, as I was talking about, what we do first is we get to know them, we meet them, we talk about the history there. If there is any driving history with those students at all. A lot of times there isn't, so it's a pretty short history. Sometimes they have a little bit of practice and we get to know, okay, well, what were you working on? What was giving you trouble? and it gives us kind of some insight to, okay, how can we help you out with those things? We use a ton of different assessments to kind of get to know them. But before we get into that, we do our vision and physical functioning assessment, which you can go one more slide for me. So with vision, it's just a quick assessment on their acuity, their depth perception, and then their peripheral vision to make sure that those are up to standards and there's no deficits there that would prohibit them from beginning to drive to begin with. Next, we would get into physical functioning, which is probably, sorry, on a different slide, but I'm just going to go over it now. The physical functioning portion of it would be a brake response time. So what we do with our brake response time is we use a machine that will measure the amount of time they can get to from the gas brake to a brake pedal when cued from a red light. So some of this, again, when it comes to these students, we kind of get a feel for how they are with following those directions and being able to pay attention to that light they're seeing when it cues them, the green light to the red light, and seeing if there's anything that kind of sparks any difficulty at all within that. So after that part of the physical functioning, which is the brake response time, is pretty much the main thing that we focus on when it comes to physical assessments. We get more into cognition. Now, the UFOV.
Next slide, please.
Yep, sorry. That not only does that kind of look at that the vision portion as well, but it also has a lot of cognitive assessment as well. We're looking at that divided attention. We're looking at selective attention and the ability to kind of shift attention or focus on two trains of thought at once. So with the UFOV, it's a pretty old program we use to assess those factors to see how that divided attention is, how that central vision is, and that ability to kind of look at one portion of the screen as well as kind of focus on something else at the same time. And that gives us a lot of information from those students as well.
One, just breaking in here, one way that kind of translates to the road, and obviously everyone's different, but you'll get these like mini populations within our autism population of people. A lot of them will be distracted by the most unnecessary information, but it may be that they don't know it's unnecessary. Like the best example would be you'll have people reading every street name they go by, a lot of businesses, advertisements, and this is kind of a good tool to see UFOV standing for useful field of vision, like what is important within your field of view and what you need to ignore. So you can get a good read on that.
Right. And as you can see from that picture on the slide there, those little triangles there that surround the car in the middle, and then the little tiny car that's somewhere around the side there, that's that kind of useless information that we want them to see if they can avoid that information and focus on the necessary information. You go to the next slide. And then this slide after that as well. So as you can see, we have the physical abilities there that I spoke of a little bit earlier, but those cognitive assessments we do, the major cognitive assessments that we're performing are the SLUMS assessment, which is the St. Louis University mental status assessment. There's the TRAILS A and B, which I'll give you a little bit of an example afterwards. The line bisection assessment, the motor-free visual perceptual test, and then the Snellgrove maze. And I'll show you examples of those kind of as we move on. So you can go to the next slide. But this is kind of going, this slide kind of is going to show you exactly like what these assessments are, what the point of each assessment is here. The MVPTs, that fitness to driving, inconsistent attentive processing, and time to respond. So what that assessment is basically a list of slides that show you figures or shapes, and the student is supposed to find those similarities in those shapes. And we look at not only are they are they seeing those figures correctly or accurately, but how quickly are they identifying the similarities? With the trail making assessment, what we're looking at is that ability to, yeah, could you go to, if you get a better idea of what it looks like, could you go to the 4 slides over, please? Yep, there. So there's that trail making assessment. Those two pictures towards the top there. It's looking at the ability to sequence, to scan, and plan ahead to find a certain path. The first one, the part A, obviously a little bit simpler with just the numbers from 1 to 25, so sequencing and just numbers. The trails B being that ability to shift between number and letter as you go up in sequence. So it's, it's looking at that alternating attention, mental sustainability, and that processing time that takes to do that. Let's see the next, and if you could go, yeah, we won't do this one.
Yeah, we don't really do much up with the slums. Sometimes we will, but our population with autism typically is not too many issues with memory, so we might skip that one and customize our clinical assessments for them for that.
So basically, those are the major assessments we're going to do, and not any one of those is going to be, that is going to tell you all the information you need to know. We kind of use all those assessments at once to kind of get an idea of how this student's going to learn, what they might need to help them out in the process once we do start driving. It gives us a lot of information on how to teach them, or but we usually use it to kind of find that personalized, way to teach that person. So once we do that, we determine if they're ready enough through those assessments to begin the behind the wheel training. And that's when I guess I'll have Brian take back over again behind the wheel.
Yes. So I know I think we have a few more minutes, I hope. So basically, we kind of always say there's more assessments we didn't have time to show, but it's basically getting a window into the brain of the person with autism. And so we have a better way of knowing how they learn, what might work best for them. But once you get in the vehicle, it's kind of like the gold standard. It's, that's what counts the most. So when you're in the vehicle, I'll give you guys just a couple examples of some things we come across, how we deal with them, some interesting stories. But the overall thing when you're going to work with someone with autism and driving is knowing that they're going to take things very literal. That's one very key factor as a driving instructor. For example, when you're giving directions, if someone's, of course, again, everyone is different, but someone who takes things very literal, if you give a direction to say, we're going to turn right at the light, that could actually be a very dangerous direction, because as soon as the words turn right come out of your mouth, believe it or not, they may turn right even if it's a curb. They're just going to turn the wheel right. So you have to say, at the lights, turn right. So the order of directions, how you communicate is very key. My favorite story, and we've never had any serious accidents. No one has jumped the curb yet, although I've heard of that happening. A story that I can tell is, again, it was very low speed, very safe situation. We were in a neighborhood and it was very snowy. And our student was doing a K-turn. If you all remember, the 3-point turn, you're turning the car around in the middle of a road. And I was training a new person, and they were still working on their, communication skills as a new driving instructor. And I was sitting in the back, and my coworker, when instructing our student to do a K-turn, motioned towards the curb up ahead and said the words, was going to say the phrase, let's do a K-turn somewhere along the road up here. But he said, let's do a K-turn, and our student immediately cranked the wheel left while we were driving down the road, and we started to spin out and slid into a snowbank. And lesson learned. I was laughing pretty hard in the back. No one was hurt, but it just was a great lesson learned by one of our instructors and how sensitive it can be. Other examples, sometimes you have someone with autism that can be, another thing you're looking for is like the mental flexibility. So it's really difficult for some of our students to grasp like the idea of like generalities of bending the rules. They know you're not supposed to go over a double yellow. So we'll have students with autism. If we weren't there, they would sideswipe a vehicle sooner than going over that double yellow because that's the rule. So trying to get them to be more mentally flexible is kind of like the key to them driving. I had one student who every time I taught him something new, he'd say, "Can I pull over and can you tell me the rule for that?" If most of you are drivers know, there's so many nuances and things that just happen on the road that there's no rule for. You can certainly review it, explain it, but some people that we work with, they need the rule, they need it to be specific, and they need that to happen every time, which is not how it works in driving. So those people typically wouldn't do very well, unfortunately. Another thing, and kind of going back, so many people that spoke today did so great. And one thing that kind of stood out to me with our first speaker today, when she was talking about the randomness of the dots, I was working with another student with autism and he was doing so well. This person could drive. He knew every rule of the road, every situation. He just knew all the rules, but his mental flexibility I told him he should probably never drive. What he would do is we might be at a traffic light intersection with a green light and he'll just make a full stop with no one in sight. And he just said, I just thought maybe someone might be coming over the hill. And I couldn't really grasp why he would make these random mistakes. And it kind of dawned on me that even though he knew all the rules, there was still very much a randomness in his brain, why cars were going. He knew the rule right of way, but once he was out there and in action, he just thought a car might go at a red light. And I'd say, but cars have to stop at a red light, right? He said, yeah, but some people run red lights. And yes, this is true, I would say, but again, in general, they're not going to run a red light. You can trust your instincts, things like that to stop the car. But a lot of our students, they just can't kind of like get that. They can't convince themselves, if you will, to put themselves in a situation that is like potentially dangerous. It's kind of funny, I've had new drivers just politely disagree with me. Brand new drivers who, were still in the neighborhood. And I'd say, well, yeah, at this kind of at a two-way stop, if you don't have a stop sign, you can't make a full stop if the other road has a stop sign and you don't. And I've had people say, well, I feel safer doing it. So I'll politely disagree with you. And you kind of know at that moment, it may not be a good idea for them to drive. So just a lot of different ways we have to communicate. Some people, and again, it's good for us as teachers working with people with autism because they'll give us new ways to communicate. One driver I had, when she turns onto a road and there's 2 lanes to choose from, as we all, I'm sure, do every time, you always pull into that closest lane or the first lane. And again, some of those phrases she doesn't understand. Even I didn't understand when I was a new driver. So you may use the term first lane or second lane. They may understand closest lane or farthest lane. They may understand right lane or left lane. Some of them won't understand any of those. And I'll just say, well, when you're turning right, stay right. When you're turning left, stay left. So it's basically finding, 100 ways to communicate the same information. And hopefully one of them kind of lands and then you've got it. You've got a new way.
I think that language and communication is definitely key when it comes to being behind the wheel. So you see a lot of that coming into play. And also emotion for sure as well. And then everybody's different. And, you'll see some people react to different emotions, in a more positive way or in a negative way. So again, just learning that the way that person, that individual is, learning to kind of work with that emotion kind of helps when you're behind the wheel to kind of like guide somebody through a process or through a situation. And then that sensory as well, just, going out there and evaluating, how much input can this person certain situation, you know, kind of easing them into those situations to help them along. That's
So,
about it.
so thank you very much. And I think that we certainly see how sensory understanding and sensory processing and sensory prediction impacts driving in very real ways, and also auditory processing. I'd like to ask all of you to put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and I'm going to address some of our panelists with questions that have come in. The first one is a combination of several questions that I'd like to address to Drs. Knight and Lawler, and that has to do with how you incorporate the viewpoint of self-advocates, of adults with autism, and opportunities for autistic researchers.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really important point. I would say there's a couple different levels at which this is happening, and we can always do better. But all of our research that comes out of developmental behavioral pediatrics is reviewed in a committee with multiple stakeholders. So it includes the researchers, it includes clinicians, but an important part of that committee is including family members and individuals who are self-advocates to review the research and talk about how we can use, make sure that our designs and what we're studying are going to be meaningful to the individuals who are contributing to the research. And then I would also say that this has been increasingly recognized internationally. And so many of us are members of the International Society for Autism Research, which is now offering more grants for autistic researchers to become involved in research and more committees to direct priorities on more of a national and international level, which I think will help improve things even beyond Rochester.
Yeah, I don't have a tremendous amount to add to that, except to say, you know, my own team is very new to this, and we are trying to listen carefully to what we're hearing in our first effort at this kind of work as to how we might be able to grow it in a way that is cognizant of these kinds of issues. One interesting thing that I've heard from some people is about, even with our own study, the choice of the audiobooks and stimulus material that we're using could have a very different impact depending on the kind of material that's involved. If a person who's involved as a subject in the study is more interested in that topic, we might see very different results. So trying to take that kind of feedback into account as we newly kind of dive into this research area is something we're excited to engage with. But yeah.
And I have a compliment for Emily Eisenstein about using both people first and self-identified language. That is very respectful. So thank you. Emily, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure. So I typically ask all of my participants as they come in what they prefer, and it is really a mix. And I just try to be respectful of that. As a student, I don't have a lot of control over who actually gets to work on the research, but I have had undergraduate research assistants in the past who identify as autistic, and I hope to have the opportunity to mentor other autistic students as well. Yeah.
A question came in for Brian and Peter about if you could describe the driving simulation experience more, and if I could sort of add a corollary question as the moderator, and are people using virtual reality like Emily is using in her study?
Yeah,
we can't hear you that well, Brian.
we currently don't have a simulator. We had one, I started in 2009, and we had just gotten one when I was here, and it was even back then, it was a little outdated. So now we've removed it from our curriculum,
it was really like 3 computer monitors. People would get very dizzy when looking at the screen because it was just, you're sitting in a chair looking at 3 screens. The programs, like the actual software, was also just not the best. Like deer might jump out in the road every literally 2 or 3 minutes. Unrealistic. But basically, we got rid of it. But now, with the technology changing, we actually have a student that is working on. He's actually built already a prototype. He took a set of his main focus was people needing hand controls, but the point is he built a simulator using kind of like a video game type software.
The Oculus.
He put on the old Oculus and he sent it to me what he's done so far, and it was amazing. So I was almost anti simulators because my experience with them was bad. They didn't seem to be helping any of our students, but now with the technology and these Oculus, the virtual reality, I think now we have something that we could probably come closer to perfecting, if you will, and we're gonna be looking at that as a company into maybe getting another simulator one of these days soon.
Wonderful. A question for Hannah Peck. One of the listeners noted that her child or his child was kept in from recess. And I think that by inference that provides sensory impact. What are your suggestions as alternatives to keeping kids in from recess?
Sure. I think what I would suggest first is, starting the conversation of, is this really working? Are they getting the end result that they really want? I think that question said something about forgetting, the punishment was happening for forgetting homework. Does taking recess away really mean that the homework all of a sudden appeared the next day? So that would be my first question. Kind of leveling up from there, I would even suggest, could it be placed on an IEP or 504 if those plans are in place, because we know that kids with autism need that opportunity for movement and gaining the sensory input from recess, but also the decompression time from all the stimuli that they've had in the classroom throughout the day. So I would suggest that it would be appropriate to be on the IEP. And then as far as replacements, that's going to vary school to school and class to class, teacher to teacher, but just some things that I would consider is, is it realistic to, maybe it's come in 10 minutes early or stay at the end of the day 10 minutes to review a checklist or visuals or a tactile cue to make sure that homework is in the hand, in the book bag, going home, and then talking with the parents to make sure that same process is happening at home to get the homework back to school. Personally, with my own, we a very receptive teacher, we had an index card system, and eventually it was a scrap paper system. So there was a paper in the pocket with checklists that the teacher, again, very generously wrote out the to-do list. I checked it off at night, everything was in the book bag and then sent in. So, we made it work so that the punishment for getting the homework assignment was not taking away something that the child needs.
And another participant noted that staying in from recess might actually be preferable for some children who don't like the chaos of the playground. Sure.
Yeah, I think maybe a broader definition of recess could be just like taking that break. It should be there to provide the opportunity to take a break from the academic and sensory stimuli load that the child has taken in the day.
It's also an opportunity for teaching social skills.
Right.
So I have to put in that plug. Brian and Peter, there's some significant interest in how do people get driving assessments? How do they contact Drive On to get them or their children evaluated?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
There's interest among the participants of how to refer themselves to you.
Oh, wonderful question. We do have a website. We work for Rochester Rehabilitation. So the website, rochesterrehab.org, you can go on our website and you can find our drive-on services there. Because Rochester Rehab has services. We do mental health and a whole bunch of things, care management. So the website's the best place. We're located at the Al Siegel Center. So we're right down the road from Strong. It's 1000 Elmwood. And again, probably if you Google us, we're not the first hit. But if you Google, again, Rochester Rehab, you can find our website through there or drive on.
And I can attest that if you do Google Drive on Rochester, you come up on top.
Oh, okay.
Because we do
Good
send,
news.
we have shared many young patients.
Great.
A couple of prompts, and then I'm going to show you a couple of the slides that we missed. Have one more question for Emily. Prompts: psychologists from U of R, if you're claiming CEUs, contact Christina Muley. There was a glitch in the REDCap system, so that they contact Christina Muley about your license number. Tomorrow's session is from 3 to 5. It's on health equity. Among our speakers will be our new division chief, Dr. Dennis Quo. And Saturday morning, the session is from 9 to 11, and it's focusing on attention, which our basic science speakers today, as well as our driving speakers and our OT, point out is a true comorbidity problem for children with autism. So please sign on tomorrow and Sunday. I want to share this slide that if any of you listening want further information about participating in research, this is the REDCap link. Will be included in the materials. You can scan this with your phone. We will have both sign language and Spanish interpretation for the rest of the session. There will be advocacy resources on the Skirboll website, and we will be sharing the audio and video of this conference through that mechanism. I have one more question for Emily, and then I'm going to play the video of the Skirboll granddaughter that you heard but didn't see. The question, Emily Knight, as opposed to Emily Eisenstein, but any of our basic scientists can answer this. Your work sounded like some of the work around automaticity differences between expert and novice, such as soccer players and tennis players, where paying attention improved the novice's performance, but interrupted the expert and led to more choking. And would any of the three of you like to comment on attention and the novice versus expert?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting because I hadn't thought about that connection, but as soon as I read it, I agreed that there does seem like that is possibly like a similar line of research. I know that many of our neurotypical brains are experts in social communication and body language. And so that might be one of the reasons we saw differences in our brain and why attention interacted in that way. Or there's other possibilities where maybe if you are overly focused on the other task we had you doing instead, that was why you were paying attention to something else. But yeah, I think that it's an interesting area of overlap. So.
Yeah, I could just add to that as people may know, a lot of these functions that we do regularly are automatized into certain brain networks that, operate without overtly kind of conscious control. So, in the context of experts playing a sport, for example, and choking, you know, when they're on autopilot, they're relying on a lot of muscle memory and automatically coded motor instructions in their brain. And when they consciously start to overthink it and what their left hand is doing, what their right hand is doing, that's where they are now actually relying on different brain regions to actually do that task, which are not the regions that they have practiced with time and again. And that's where they start to make mistakes. So speech is an interesting one in our context because it's such what we call an overlearned skill. We practice speech for hours a day, most days. And so the automaticity that comes with that is something that we really have baked into us pretty well. And if that does differ in folks with autism, particularly if they're not as social and they haven't used speech quite as much, that's another factor that we might have to consider. Not just how the wiring of the brain through development, but the actual less practice in using speech might be a factor in what we're talking about too.
So fascinating discussion today. You can see the bidirectional interaction of what we learn about the brain and how we practice it, both in with younger children and with driving. Even trying to put together the deer jumping in front of the car that Brian and Peter brought up with Emily's studies of biologic motion, with understanding the auditory input and the distractions that go into driving, and the motor memory and the muscle and the touch that Emily Eisenstein was talking about, and how all of this came together in Hannah's presentation. So I'm really excited that you all got to see this from soup to nuts. We'll be putting the video in the archive so that you can access it. And I think we'll be able to send you all the link. Psychologists, contact Christina Muley. I'm going to show the Skirboll granddaughter video, and thank all of you for your attention on this Thursday afternoon. And we're really very, very excited about the next two sessions that are coming up and all that's going to come from the interactions we've had today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Axelrod, and I am the granddaughter of Bunny and Mort Skirboll. This conference is so important to me because I am currently a special education teacher. This conference was also so important to my grandfather, and I know that he would be so happy to see that although we can't all be together in person today, that we are still able to have this conference over Zoom. My grandfather was always so proud of my work in the special education field, and we loved being able to share new things that we have learned in the conferences with each other. The information and resources provided to families, educators, and other professionals in the field are so valuable and can really make a positive impact on the way that we can best support children with autism. I hope you all enjoy this year's conference and leave with new information. Thank you so much for being here and supporting the Skirboll Family Autism Conference.
So thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow.